The Ministry of Finance and the Public Service presents Let's Talk Finance, a feature exploring the various elements of the economic program.
Welcome again to Let's Talk Finance here on Nationwide 90 FM. My name is George Davis. My guest this week is a gentleman who has been with the Ministry of Finance, now in the latest iteration, Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, since 1997. He's vastly experienced. He knows the landscape very well, and he is most nimble in his area of interest. His name, Trevor Anderson. He's the acting principal director in the Fiscal Policy Management Unit at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, and he's here to talk about fiscal policy management. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you, George, and good morning to your listeners.
Excellent. Such a long career in the public service. I guess the best place to start with this discussion is the changes you would have seen, participated in, within the finance ministry towards getting the fiscal policy management policy aligned with the direction that the country wants to get to in terms of debt management, managing the finances, and making sure that there's order so that regardless of administration change, you can have one track at least in that particular area. What have some of those changes been since the time that you've been with the ministry?
All right. Between 1997 and 2009, fiscal management was largely determined by the general goals of any particular administration that's in office, and the technocrats would always provide prudent advice. Nonetheless, there wasn't any firm requirement to adhere to what I would call fiscal discipline.
Yes.
Jamaica had to embrace fiscal discipline starting in the year 2010.
Yes.
2010 is what I would refer to as a watershed year in fiscal management for Jamaica.
Yes.
That year, the fiscal responsibility legislation was first tabled. Mm-hmm. And that initial legislation had three basic fiscal rules. A spending rule, what we refer to as the wage to GDP ratio.
Yes.
The debt rule, or the debt to GDP ratio, and the balance rule, the requirement for the fiscal operations to be run with a surplus.
Yes.
You would recognize that persistent fiscal deficits over the previous decades were partly responsible for the significant growth in the debt stock.
Yes.
Having decided to embrace fiscal discipline, the government went further in 2014 to do enhanced fiscal rules.
Yes.
And that involved legislation which entailed further targets for the debt in terms of achieving a 60% of GDP by fiscal year 25-26. Mm-hmm. It meant an extension of the spending rule from the initial year of 15-16,
yes,
where we were required to achieve 9%. Through no fault of central government, mm-hmm. That target had to be shifted out to the current fiscal year, 18-19.
Yes.
Where we're still required now to achieve 9% of GDP. And the balance rule has been retained. What has been introduced is something called a notional account. And what that speaks to is if you have a particular fiscal balance to achieve in any one fiscal year, mm-hmm. and there's some deviation at the end of that fiscal year, that deviation is recorded in this notional account.
Yes.
Kind of like let's call it a fiscal bank account.
Yes.
So if it's let's say you were supposed to achieve a 0.5% surplus.
Yes.
you ended up with a 0.5% deficit.
Yes.
That 0.5, that negative 0.5, is placed in this account. And what it means is that in the succeeding fiscal year, the Minister of Finance is required to table certain measures such that the fiscal balance deviation is wiped.
Yes.
So if you were to achieve a 0.5 again
Yes.
in the succeeding year, because you had that negative 0.5 from the first year,
Yes.
you now have to run a positive 1%.
Absolutely.
There is something else which we need to also say. And most persons ask the question, where did this 9% come from? What is the merit
Yes.
of
Is
this
it a magic number?
It's not a magic number.
Yes.
The fact is that historical data shows that we have been less than 9% before, back in the early 90s when we were running surpluses.
Yes.
That 9% or spending rule really seeks to anchor that key government line item of expenditure to link it to the national cake. Because what you don't want is government spending to be growing faster than, say, the rate of growth of the economy.
Yes.
Because government is the largest employer, the impact on the economy from spending, it has to be managed.
Yeah, and I interject to say, I remember as a high schooler listening to Dr. Omar Davis present the budget, the opening presentation, and him lamenting that for every dollar in revenue that the government earned, 80 cents would go towards debt servicing and, of course, payment of wages and salaries in the
Yes.
public sector, with only 20 cents left for the crucial infrastructure works and effectively running the country.
Right.
And you're saying that these rules and the implementation of same changes that reality.
Yes.
Yes, and puts us in a positive situation where there is a greater share of that proverbial dollar to be spent on the important things of keeping the country running.
Yes. And keeping the country running in terms of building and maintaining capital infrastructure,
Yes.
building and maintaining the quality of the social fabric.
Yes.
It makes better sense to reduce your debt burden, reduce your debt service costs, and put these resources to work on your human resources.
Yes.
We're talking about training, education. We're talking about minimizing the impact of the economic reform program on the poor and the vulnerable.
Yes.
And that is why we have a social spending target in the budget that is normally exceeded, and so we try to keep the social side of the equation in balance.
You know, one of the questions that often emerge in discussions among persons looking on at the work of the finance ministry and by extension the government, and of course the relationship with the IMF since the JLP administration of 07 to December 2011.
Yes.
You identify 2010 as a watershed year
Yes.
where fiscal policy management is concerned, and I blend everything to say, people say, well, the targets that have been set perhaps are a little too onerous given the situation that Jamaica is emerging from, and perhaps it is that these targets were imposed on the government rather than the targets being a function of where the country can reasonably go given its history. So I put that to you and ask you for a response in terms of these targets under this policy management strategy.
Yes.
Were those numbers imposed by some man in a suit from Washington, some technocrat somewhere, or is it a function of where the Jamaican economy was coming from and where it can reasonably go if we maintain, that word again, discipline?
Yes. They weren't, quote unquote, imposed. Jamaica was, and I'm speaking in terms of the fiscal position now,
Yes.
and the economy in general.
Yes.
Jamaica was at the brink in 2009. What I mean by that, in terms of servicing the debt, we were very close to default. And so, recognizing that we didn't want to tarnish that excellent record we have had in terms of servicing the debt,
Yes.
which is the first charge under the Constitution,
Yes.
the government decided to engage the assistance of the IMF, and one of the critical planks of the 2010 SBA and the 2013 EFF was the debt exchange.
Yeah, and SBA listeners, standby
Standby
agreement,
agreement,
EFF, extended fund facility.
fund facility. Those two measures were crucial in terms of managing in a sustainable, credible, predictable way, managing your debt service costs downwards.
Yes.
I think good sense prevailed. There were a few investors who were holding up, but the vast majority of investors in government instruments, they agreed with the debt exchange as opposed to having a full-fledged haircut. And that afforded the government the necessary fiscal space,
Yes.
the room
Yes.
within which to operate. At the time also, revenues were pretty much uncertain. Bauxite was closing.
Yes.
There was uncertainty with respect to tourism arrivals
Yes.
because of the
Agriculture
global
was
financial crisis.
Firing, construction down, yes.
That's the backdrop that made the then government decide to embrace fiscal discipline in 2010, which is why I said it's a watershed year.
Yes.
In 2013,
Yes.
the new administration under the EFF, they went further.
Yes.
They embraced enhanced fiscal discipline.
Yes.
And so we're at a point now where I think both sides of the political fence
Yes.
understand the necessity
Yes.
and the importance of fiscal discipline.
Stick a pin right there, Trevor. We have to wrap this conversation here, but we're going to have to continue it next week when we talk about the fiscal policy management program.
Yes.
And very crucial thing you said, because it's not often that both political parties, the two major ones, are in tandem in terms of the direction of the economy. But given that both have had a hand in taking us to this point in terms of managing that fiscal policy process, there is that buy-in, there is that harmony around
Yes.
where we need to go and the things we need to do, and that's very important. Trevor Anderson, thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Good. That's it for Let's Talk Finance. Back next week with more.
That was Let's Talk Finance, brought to you by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service.